card section, it is sort of closed off a little bit. I think you can sort of sneak through. Yeah, we come around this way, and then you sorry. Okay, so I've got Zoom.
We've done it
on this one. He's ready, so we'll do.
So, we'll do it another time.
That's okay. That's just double click. Remember that one was just we just double click it and it's ready to go. This one.
Okay.
And then yeah.
I will. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Oh yeah, what was your surname?
Makira?
Was that with a M?
Yeah.
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 These, I've got 2 here for you. Are those the ones you're after? Would you like a paper bag for those? Sure.
Thank you. Have a great night. You too.
they see us on Zoom right now, can they?
Not yet.
They're not letting yet.
So soon.
It's weird having the camera pointed at us. Yes, I think I am. Just think about it. One phone is turned off.
And you're ready to roll.
Right on time. Very good.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening to celebrate the launch of Dr. Alicia Cameron, otherwise known as Lucy, Dr. Lucy Cameron's new book, Building an Innovation Hotspot. My name is Jackie Ryan. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Jagera and Turrbal people, along with the traditional owners of the lands from which people are zooming in on tonight. I also pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that we are on unceded land. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. For those attending in person tonight, should you need to use the bathroom, there's one just up here, up the stairs and to your right. There's also one at the back for people who do not feel like tackling stairs. There's a bar just behind us that will open again after the event. There will be a Q&A. Due to COVID, I'll just be walking around and holding the mic at arm's length. So that means if your questions are too long, I'll start to grow weary and the microphone will slowly fall away from you. So it's probably a good idea to keep them short, bearing in mind my tiny little arms. There will be a signing after the event. I'd like to draw your attention to the copies of the book on the counter there, so they're very easy to access. I'll also ask you to turn your phones and pages to silent. And of course, you can still keep them on so that you can tweet about the event and your photos at avidreader4101. For those of you attending on Zoom, we'll be pasting a link in the chat box that you can use to purchase your copies of the book. If you do so during the event, we'll also be able to ask the good doctor to sign them at the end of the event for you. You can also ask author questions using that same chat box in Zoom, and we'll be able to pass them on later. So tonight, Dr. Cameron is in conversation with Paul Barclay. Paul Barclay is a Walkley Award-winning journalist and broadcaster with an appetite for ideas and in-depth analysis and discussion. He's recording this talk tonight for RN's Big Ideas. Please make them both welcome.
Thanks, Jackie. It's great to be back at Avid Reader as always. Thanks to Avid for having me again. Thanks very much, Fiona. It's always just a pleasure, and it's an increased pleasure seeing as I no longer live in Brisbane to come back here. So yeah, really terrific to be here this evening. This talk is being recorded for Big Ideas. I reckon it'll be on air in the next few weeks. Just follow the Big Ideas webpage on the RN website and you'll get to see it coming up. Look, as we're all aware, I think digital technologies have changed the way we live our lives, and they're driving innovation and new industries. And these new businesses and startups, as we've seen most prominently with Silicon Valley, can cross-fertilize and spawn others, stimulating local economies, creating jobs, wealth, developing sought-after skills, fostering a culture of innovation and improving productivity. And with old industries on the decline, and arguably in Australia, in particular, too much reliance on the traditional export sector, it's important that we modernise our economy. How do we do so? Well, all over the world, governments are eager to see innovation hotspots take root in their local regions and states. And in Australia, indeed here in Queensland, we've seen efforts to create such hotspots. What is the role of government in stimulating these industries? Why do plans for high-tech digital hubs often not come to fruition? What are the mistakes that we make, and why do others succeed? Well, all of this is explained in Dr. Lucy Cameron's book, Building an Innovation Hotspot. I learned a lot from it. Lucy is Senior Research Consultant at Data 61 Insight Team at the CSIRO, author of the book that I'm waving in front of you right now, for sale later, by the way. Welcome, Lucy.
Thanks, Paul, and welcome back to Brisbane.
No,
so good to have you back.
It is great to be back. It's such a familiar place to be. Now, reading the book, I understand that you worked with state government for about a decade in this kind of area, working on innovation policy. What were you doing and how much did your work in that decade inform what's in this book?
Yeah, so I completed a PhD at the University of Queensland and immediately got a job as an industry development officer in the state development area. I originally worked in creative industries development, and then I switched over to ICT industry development. And, the goal of a lot of ICT industry development areas is to build the next Silicon Valley and, to invest in Queensland ICT industry so it will grow and become this self-sustaining critical mass of investment attracting businesses, which then go on and enable all the rest of the economy through digital technologies and other things.
And I should just say ICT being information and
communications technologies.
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
sorry, I should have spelled that out. But it is one of those enabling industries, but is also an industry in itself. And one of the constant definitional debates was what is an ICT company, because it's often in education or it's in gaming or it's, in tourism, like What If and Flight Centre, they're ICT companies and they're tourism companies. So it was very hard to define the industry, but it's when you're actually in the trenches of those sort of departments, you kind of have to work out, well, what are the levers that we can pull? And that was really kind of the genesis of this book, because it was out of that I started to think, well, what is the role of government? And everyone around me was working in government going, well, what is our role? What can we do? What can't we do? And then I put in an application to go and study the role of government in building hotspots at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. And I looked at an exhibition that they had on from the Lemelson Centre, which is the Centre for Invention and Innovation there. They had identified 6 hotspots in the American landscape and profiled those pretty comprehensively from a historical perspective. So it's an enormous privilege, and it informed what I thought when I came back to Australia and looked at, well, actually the role of government, the most effective role of government is probably not what we're leaning on here in Australia. They were leaning on other things like procurement and regulation reform and a number of other mechanisms. So that and my 10 years in government really was the making of this book. And what I hope it is kind of like a cheat sheet for new innovation officers who just, start in the field and they start reading some of the theorists like Michael Porter or Richard Florida or Mariana Mazzucato, and, they don't get swept away with just one approach.
Well, what it is actually is an indication of just how tricky this innovation business is, how many ducks you need to line up in a row, how important kind of the overall context is. It's not just about, hey, let's pick a place that looks like it might work and some sexy new industry and throw a bunch of money at it. Not like that at all, is it?
No, and that's been the biggest mistake I think we've made, is that we've said, here's a great area, let's try and attract everyone in here. And, really that is, co-location is just like the minimal part of it. And really, I guess I came back from the US saying, providing the work, not the actual place, is the better way to go about it, because you're providing the money and the purpose and the application, and you're building their market validation, and they can cluster organically. Like they will build their own clusters and build their own support networks and their own supply chains. But telling them where to go, unless it's around a big infrastructure that they need, and possibly airports and ports and other areas, maybe an incentive for where they should go. But really, they want the work. If Queensland can become a work magnet, then we will be attracting a lot more of that innovation to this state.
We will talk about the examples that you quote, some of the examples that you quote in the book, but let's just start with the example that everybody quotes of Silicon Valley.
Yes.
I mean, did Silicon Valley organically just create? Was it fostered by government? How do we explain the unbelievable success of Silicon Valley?
Well, Silicon Valley has a 100-year history, and most people think it started in the 1980s, but it actually started when America won the Americo-Spanish War in 1894, I think it was. But they acquired all these new Pacific and Caribbean territories, like Guam and the Marshall Islands and the Philippines. They needed to communicate with those islands. So when Guglielmo Marconi came along with the new radio technologies, they set up towers along the east and the west coast, but on the west coast, they developed all these new naval bases, and they started to engage engineers from all around the country to build radio technologies so they could communicate with their naval fleets in the Pacific Islands and the Caribbean. So there was a huge amount of engineering already going on, and the vacuum tubes on the circuits which created radio became the integrated circuits, which then turned to germanium, or were based on germanium and turned to silicon, and they became the silicon chip. Right. And so the thing that really built the first Silicon Valley in its first life after, and I'll talk about after 1980, but in its first life, it was really naval contracts. And the Navy was the main contractor, the angel investor. They were the ones with the keeping the under 5-year-old companies alive. And they were also capitalising on the railways being built to the East Coast. And one of the early pioneers of Silicon Valley is an Australian called Cyril Elwell, who he built the engineering company, which then started building the vacuum tubes, which then, went on in the history to eventually be silicon chips.
Wow.
So it had this huge life as a naval contracting cluster of engineering companies before it actually became what we know it as this huge, home of Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Apple and all those massive companies that are now there on the west coast of the US.
I had no idea about any of that. Really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether we should define what an innovation hotspot is. I think we've all got a kind of idea in our head of what it is. But give us a brief definition of what an innovation hotspot is and whether we actually have any that meet that definition here in Australia.
Well, you're right to say that there is a definitional issue because people define it in different ways all around the world. I've defined it quite loosely in the book as any area which is outcompeting its peers in the same country in innovation metrics like IP generation or skills development and growing, like the companies in there are growing at a faster rate than peers in the same country. Yep. So, they're also clusters of the same kind of industry in part, and they are usually focused on one specialist area, but they don't need to be. They can just be, say the ICT industry is very enabling of other sectors and other companies. So you can have just a broad area which is growing faster than the rest of the country.
Okay. Do we have an innovation hotspot that meets that definition anywhere in the country?
Well, I think we do have areas which would say have higher skills quotients,
yep.
which are where you've got, more people that are tertiary educated or
yep.
Educated in particular skills. Docklands in Melbourne, in Brisbane, there was a cluster of ICT companies around Milton at one stage. Yep. Fortitude Valley has a lot of creative industries in it. The James Cook and Townsville University are a hotspot of marine technologies and marine knowledge. So you've got these smaller specialist areas around Australia, usually based on the geographic features. But
so some of the preconditions are there for sparking it. But as you say in the book, it's trickier than it seems. And just coming to that point, what makes it so tricky? Can you talk about that?
Well, in Australia, I think we've got a number of headwinds against us. One is, when the Australian dollar rises quickly due to high commodity prices or other things, that means our wages become uncompetitive. And, in Queensland, we had an investment package, for instance, for the video games industry. Yeah. And we were quoting figures like 60% of the video games industry in Australia resides in Brisbane. And a lot of that was around imported studios like Pandemic and other studios that had come over, and they were taking advantage of our skills in this area. And most of the local universities started to develop video game skills here.
And there were private education colleges that actually sprung up offering courses in that sector as well.
That's right, yeah. And also universities like QUT start to really specialise in video games development. So, you know, we were building this cluster of video games expertise and skills and that sort of thing. But then 2008, 2009 happened and the Australian dollar peaked, and so much of it just went offshore within 12 months. And that's the, you know, one of the disadvantages we have in Australia, in that, you know, we do have this, you know, the currency and the commodity markets sometimes suppress the skills markets and they go offshore. Another one is that we are a small market, you know, we're not America. We're a tenth of the size of America. But on that though, you know, we have Asia sitting on our doorstep. And, you know, that is a massive market for us. And, you know, we can be doing a lot more to integrate Asian developers, as well as, you know, look at the Asian middle classes and look at what they need in terms of this area. In terms of our tailwinds, we've got fantastic skills here. We've got fantastic education institutions here. And we've also now got all these amazing bandwidth-based technologies, which means that we don't actually have to be based in America to access the American market. We can be based here. And I think that's what companies like Atlassian and other big companies which have said, no, we're staying in Australia, have shown us they can be globally integrated and sell to big markets overseas.
So it's a bit of a game changer, isn't it? Did the pandemic too demonstrate that you didn't need to be in the same room as people or in the same geographic location? I think, you know, in the past, you'd hear about people who would fly halfway around the world to sign a contract or to have a conversation leading up to signing a contract. And before the pandemic arrived, if you'd said to people, oh, no, that can all be done remotely, they would have said, are you crazy? You need those personal contacts. But so the pandemic shifted all of that, and you're saying reduced a kind of disadvantage, an inherent disadvantage that we have.
Well, I think, and, you know, I haven't read anything that, you know, conclusively that supports this, but what I think it did was it created that trust to do things by distance. Like before that, we said, oh no, you have to be in the same room to look people in the eye and have that trust relationship. You don't do a deal with someone until you've shaken their hands and met them. Whereas now, you know, perhaps you can. Perhaps you can have that really much deeper personal relationship by video conference. Like if I, for instance, got a venture capital manager from Silicon Valley, they used to have a 20-minute rule where they wouldn't actually support any ventures which were more than 20 minutes from the headquarters of the VC firm, because they wanted to be able to go down there and slap them around a bit and say, you know, what are you doing with my money? Are you investing it wisely? Whereas now I think, you know, maybe they would invest further via video conference and support, you know, firms in Brisbane maybe, or firms around the world where they can have, you know, weekly or twice weekly Zoom meetings and grill them over what they're doing with their money and who they're meeting and how they're training their people and, you know, what's happening with the firm.
Yeah, so, I think it's worth talking a little bit more about Atlassian actually, because well, their founder, Mike Cannon-Brookes, has been in the news lately. People will have heard of him, I think. He's now worth $20 billion.
Wow.
They're about to build a new headquarters in Sydney, which will anchor a new tech central precinct there. So that goes to this innovation hub that we're talking about. The building is planned to be the world's tallest hybrid timber structure and will embody leading edge sustainability technology. So that reflects his commitment to moving into that space. But the most important part of this whole thing is that, as you said before, he's committed to staying in Australia. Now, we've seen so many of our great minds and innovators and ideas go offshore and overseas companies, make money out of them. So I suppose, I mean, it's great that Mike Cannon Brooks and that company have decided to stay here. I suppose my question to you, though, as someone who's looked at this, is what more can policymakers do to ensure that we have more Atlassian type companies that grow, become successful, and then don't bail when, as you say, Australian wages lift as a result of currency fluctuations?
Well, that's a great question. And I think there's support at different levels. So what you need to support Atlassian to stay is probably very different to what you need to do to support the genesis of new enterprises. And with the genesis of new enterprises, you know, they need early funding. They need a work contract very early on. And for a lot of times, you know, Silicon Valley, for instance, was really built on the government procurement model of going out there and saying, you know, we want to know your new technology. We're in a war now, you know, come to us with your new tech, and we'll test it out in government and co-develop it with you. So if people like drones producers or AR makers or video games makers can get an early contract with government to make something, and that might be mine safety equipment, or it might be, you know, it might be drones to look at power lines or do disaster assessments or something like that, then that helps build the early stage industries. But a lot of government procurement regulations say we'll only procure with the big guys because they're less risky. And there's not a lot of will within a lot of government to co-develop either. And that's the big difference between, say, how the Navy dealt with Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and how a lot of, you know, government departments now deal with the environment around them in terms of entrepreneurs. So governments can procure. One of the other trends is in innovation has been mission-based innovation. And there's a whole chapter in the book about mission-based innovation, which really took off after Mariana Mazzucato wrote a book about it. But prior to that, she wrote another book called The Entrepreneurial State. And I'd recommend anyone who's interested in government innovation to read that book, because basically what she said is that all the technologies in an iPhone were developed for government first. And then they were just packaged up and sold by Apple as an iPhone. But GUI interface, GPS, the internet itself, you know, a lot of the telephony technology, they were all government applications before they were packaged up and sold on as
it's rent-seeking, really, isn't it, by Apple?
They did do a bit of work. But you know, that was the role of government in the generation of all those Apple technologies, is that they actually created a lot of those breakthroughs, which then built the tech. So you know, it's an overlooked mechanism to creating clusters, but actually contracting early those companies, but also setting a mission has been really effective. So one of the examples I gave in the book too is Fort Collins in the US.
Yeah.
And Fort Collins is like an outback, well, what we'd call outback, a country town in the mountains of Colorado. Yep. It's got Colorado State University, and it's next to Boulder, which is kind of a sister city. But it's got a bit of a history in hydroelectricity because there's a big dam there. But a key person moved in to Colorado State University, and they partnered with the local government to develop green energy technologies. And they created a small...
That key person was an engineering professor that moved into the university. I love this story, maybe partly because my partner works at universities, and universities have been under the hammer a bit of late in Australia. But this is such an inspiring story. But yeah, go ahead, how he integrated students, used students, and used a disused energy station in Fort Collins.
Yes. And it's a lovely picture of this disused energy station becoming the centre of green energy. But they also set a mission of net zero, before anyone else had really set that mission. So as a town, they were going to bring down all their emissions to net zero through creating a smart grid and having all these people feed innovative green technologies in. And they were using, biotechnologies, and they were using solar technologies. And you know, a beer plant was using fermentation sort of thing to create electricity, feed it back into the grid and create a net zero. So it was, they created a mission and a kind of a platform whereby everyone could innovate. And they started to produce patents at 4 times the rate of other areas in, you know, small town America. And it's a great example because, you know, 20 years ago, Fort Collins was not on anyone's map for innovation. And, you know, people often say, oh, you have to be Silicon Valley or you have to have this huge budget. I don't think you do. I think whatever budget you have, you can pivot that to try new things. And, you know, I used to live in the Northern Rivers in Lismore. They started using the waste facility to experiment with creating worm farms and fertilizer and, you know, using that to then create income. And I don't know if they patented out of that, but, you know, perhaps they should have. But, you know, I don't think you have to be big is my point. You can use any budget that you've got to lead the way and try new stuff.
So Fort Collins is interesting. I mean, population tripled in 40 years. As you say, a kind of small American town at the foot of the Rockies that had an agricultural economic focus that did almost everything that we want an economy to do, to shift out of an older industry into a newer industry. If you could distill it, what can we learn from what they did right that perhaps we could apply here to jurisdictions who are interested in going down that road?
I think they took a comprehensive approach. They looked at what they were good at. They attracted key people. They set a mission. They attracted R&D, so it was finance. They just had a bit of everything and they made it contextual. And I don't see why every town in Australia can't do a similar thing to that. And that's why it's the final case study, because it's such a good example.
It pulls all the threads together.
Pulls all of them together.
I think we should at this point talk about the 6 threads actually that you mention in the book. And I'll list them and you can perhaps just expand on them as you see fit. So innovation being place-led, being culture-led, technology-led, you just mentioned mission-led, finance-led. So I suppose we're talking about R&D and venture capital there, and skills-led, making sure you've got the education to generate the graduates who can move into that space. Can you just talk about those 6 areas, why they are so important and why they should be the kind of focus of government strategies in this area?
Yeah. Well, I listed them really because I feel like we've gone on waves of enthusiasm with them and then waves of skepticism, and we've sort of come out saying, well, you can't just rely on that alone. You have to do everything. So with say culture-led innovation, and that really bounced off the work of Richard Florida and Annalise Saxenian, who looked at, well, how do you attract the creative class to an area? And this created downtown revival movements all across America and around the world, where they would say, well, what do young, hip, trendy, you know, rights-based people want in life? And how do we get them here? And, you know, a lot of it was cheap rent and vegetarian food and vegan restaurants and stuff like that. But, you know, he had a boho index. But a lot of it was also about, you know, nice places to live and attractive, where there's cultural institutions and arts institutions and lifestyle things. And one of the you know, big things about Fort Collins was that it had an outdoor lifestyle of hiking and biking and mountain biking and canoeing. And, you know, they really focused a lot on the lifestyle that it was associated with that kind of living instead of smoggy downtown New York sort of thing. But so, yeah, the lifestyle one is attractive, but you can't rely on it. Again, you know, there's a lot of livable areas around the world which aren't innovative. And then place-led, I think we've gone a little bit down that in that, you know, co-location is great and it is essential, but it is, you can't just artificially create it and say that's enough. The other one was finance-led. You know, innovation is incredibly expensive.
Yes, that's right.
And risky. And, this is why a lot of government departments don't get into it, because, their job is to spend efficiently. And that's not a criticism, but in some ways they kind of miss out on building those new industries if that's all they do. But it needs money. So you need to be able to attract finance, to attract the innovative people to access that finance. And that's in R&D or VC, or, some of the newer methods, which I've talked a little bit about in the book. The games industry, for instance, is getting a bit into cryptocurrency generation of funds and that sort of thing. Technology-led innovation is that focus on the technology. So if I come to you as a government department officer and say, I've got this new way of accounting, making sure all the government departments meet their spends in accounting or something.
Yep.
They probably get those approaches a lot. But if there's no one there to say, okay, show me and let me assess it, then you're not going to be able to support that new innovation or whatever it is. So that, to me, the messages of this book is that you need to have a comprehensive contextual approach. And the final chapters is really about saying, it's always changing as well, because artificial intelligence, blockchain, robotics, all the new digital technologies, crypto are changing the way of where innovation is occurring and how it's occurring. 20 years ago, we didn't have crowdfunding platforms. And yet in Australia, crowdfunding actually funds quite a bit of new product innovation.
Amazing amount, We'll come to that, because the future of innovation is really interesting, actually. Industry 4.0, the concept that I was getting my head around. We'll talk about that. You were telling me, though, that Australian industry is good at employing innovations to improve efficiency and productivity, and reaping the rewards of that. That's good. We want that. Not so good, though, at creating their own technology and innovation. So we're relying on importing and using innovation created by others. There's nothing wrong with that. Why are we failing, though, at the creating of it ourselves? Yeah. So I think there are some structural issues like the currency and the commodity markets and that sort of thing. But there are also, I think we are in this mindset of we're a little country in a little market, and what we do is adopt technologies really well. And when you look at Australia, you'd put us in the technology consumer category. We're not known for our ICT exports or our IP exports necessarily. We are a consumer of technology. And what we really want to become is a producer of IP so that we can get all these intellectual property. So we can get all these receipts from intellectual property and grow in terms of our power to create things. And the OECD has, three main definitions of innovation. One is product innovation. So that's where you're creating new technologies. And when you're at that technological frontier, you're the most efficient countries in the world, and you've adopted all you can adopt. That's the only place you can go, is creating new technologies to become more efficient. So that's why countries like Sweden and Finland, they're technology creators. And then there's process innovation, which is where you become more efficient, and we're super good at that as a country. And then there's marketing innovation, and we possibly could be better at that. But I feel as though, as a country, we've focused on adopting technologies to become more efficient. What we need to do is focus on how we can create more IP out of everything we do. Because that will make us more efficient and more creative, and produce more that we can then get intellectual property receipts from. And there was a fantastic program in New Zealand probably 2 decades ago now, called Better by Design, where they went around to all their manufacturers and they said to those manufacturers, okay, you're great at actually producing these strollers and these bathroom taps and all these other things that you produce. What we want you to do is protect all that IP and sell the licenses, and then China can produce them and you can just create more products.
And so that's what they did. And they had a huge turnaround in profits for those companies, which they then taught how to create IP from.
Mm.
And that's kind of the switch I feel like Australia has to go through. It's got to go through. It's not just about adopting and becoming more efficient at what you do. It's about creating IP in everything that you do and protecting that and selling that IP on.
Well, a really good example, obviously, is your own organisation, CSIRO, which invented Wi-Fi, which the rest of the world jumped on and started to use. Some of the big tech companies started to take advantage of this great technology. And to the CSIRO's credit, they decided to enforce the intellectual property they had on that invention and make these people pay their due royalties. More of Australia and more of Australian innovation should be doing that and thinking in that way.
Exactly. And, you know, the Wi-Fi story has funded now this massive venture capital fund called Main Sequence Ventures, which was seeded with $100 million from the proceeds of Wi-Fi. So we feel as though it is feeding back into the intellectual property, you know, learnings of Australia to build up more IP generating industry here. But, you know, it was the first time a technology had been actually created as the standard for short range radio communication. And because it became a standard and not a product, there were a lot of people who argued that it shouldn't have been patented, that, you know, we shouldn't patent it. And really, you know, it was almost like patenting genes or something. It was, you know, a little bit not right. But CSIRO went over, defended that patent with a smaller company. And once that precedent was set, then the bigger companies paid up. And it's because they paid up that we've now got this venture capital fund, which CSIRO is now investing in the next generation of those kind of companies and technologies.
And it's a fantastic story, and it is obviously beneficial in terms of the additional revenue that allows us to then hopefully build the next generation of innovation. But I do wonder whether or not this whole notion of thinking about intellectual property is a cultural mindset. You know, we have often thought about us in Australia about the industries that we've lost and the industries we'd like to get back. You know, lost a whole lot of manufacturing, and there's talk about getting manufacturing back in Australia in advanced form, which is fine. But I just wonder whether we have a mindset that, you know, is around enforcing the intellectual property returns that we get from the innovations that we make here.
Maybe. I'm not sure. You know, IP Australia would like to turn that around, that's for sure, because, you know, they're offering free education courses online now across the country. I know in our organisation we get invited to IP seminars regularly, because there is a bit of an art to knowing when to bring the lawyers in and what to protect and what not to protect. I know a lot of the ICT industry don't bother protecting code, for instance, but they might protect the product. But yeah, I do think there is a mindset shift, and even just, you know, whatever you're doing, look at what intellectual property you can capture in that, whether it's a urban design or whether it's a new heating cooling system, whatever it is, there's possibly IP you can capture in that and license. And, you know, it may not turn out to be that valuable, but if it does, it would be great if you can then sell that knowledge on to the rest of the world.
Another example that you talk about was the proposed Cellulose Valley Technology Hub Park in Lismore. Something that didn't come off. Tell us about the vision and why it failed.
So this is an example of a place-based park that didn't succeed. What happened was that the local economic development agency got together with the university. So they started off doing the right thing, and they said, well, what are we good at? And, you know, we're good at natural medicines. Let's look at how we can get those natural medicines tested at the university, and then we can market them to around the world. So what we want to build here is Cellulose Valley, which is the cellulose equivalent to Silicon Valley. What they did was that they used a big federal grant to buy a piece of land next to the university, and they only really had enough money to build a road up into the park, and they employed 2 officers for about a year. but no one came. Like the big manufacturers and the big plant companies, and, you know, they had tea tree oil, Thursday Island, you know, people around in the area, and a lot of natural medicines were there. But they were clustering in the industrial parks of Byron Bay. They were clustering elsewhere. They had no interest whatsoever in coming to this, like, you know, kind of paddock area next to a small university. And it would have been hugely expensive for them to move their operations there, and there was no assistance to help them do that. And you don't actually need to be next to a university to have your products tested. So it just, you know, it just completely didn't work. That money, you know, it built a road and employed people for a year, but that's all you can really say happened with it. And I think these are really great examples, not to just hide and shelve. They're really great examples to learn from. And I think that's the other thing in innovation is you've got to learn to take failure on the chin a little bit.
I think so, yeah, that's right.
You know,
that's what you learn from, isn't it?
We tried, it didn't work. But when you're dealing with public money, it's very hard.
A lack of venture capital is also often cited as the reason why technological innovation is thwarted in Australia. People say that it's, you know, that culturally we like to invest money in speculating in the property market and making returns that way rather than the hard yards of investing in higher risk technology. Is there any truth in that? And in the fact that the limited amount of venture capital is inhibiting technological development?
Well, venture capital is incredibly effective where it exists. And one of the theories as to why it's incredibly effective is because you have these fund managers who know the business and know how to grow and scale businesses. And if you are given angel money, or not angel money, but venture money, you can expect to be controlled a little bit by that venture capital firm. But in a good way, often, in that they will connect you and network you and help you grow your business because they've got a bit of skin in the game. So in that way, it is highly effective. And one of the reasons why Israel thought, or one of the reasons why we think Israel is so great at attracting venture capital, but also commercializing their technologies, is because they have venture firms which came from the US and showed them how to do it, and showed them how to list on the stock exchange, and showed them how to grow their industries. So it is hugely effective. However, it is highly concentrated. It goes for the scalable companies. So if you're just, you know, inventing a device to help you in long haul flights or something,
Device.
A niche device, you know, they're not really that interested in that. They want a scalable, global, digital, often, if not pharmaceutical product that they can invest a little bit in and see it exponentially grow. So, you know, it's very picky. And after the pandemic, there were signs that it was becoming far more risk adverse as well. So it was only investing at later stages in more surefire things. So it's often touted as the secret sauce. Like I was listening to a Freakonomics podcast, and they're saying, is venture capital the secret sauce? Possibly for a very small sector of industry, the RCT industry, it is effective, but it's not for everyone. R&D funding is much greater in scale, more widely spread, and you know, you can create with R&D funding that triple helix model of industry, government, academia, or research, and it's a fantastic model to build.
When we've got excellent universities in Australia and excellent minds in those universities and excellent research, how much can our universities contribute to innovation, and how much better do they need to get at forming the connections with industry to do so?
That's a great question. I think I say in the book that the role of universities cannot be understated, because they are just magic in terms of creating, you know, the learning that needs to be done, but they can be much better matched to local industry needs. And that's such a win-win situation, because local students get early experience, they get embedded in the economic infrastructure of your local economy, they get paid to, you know, do their final year project or whatever it is. And you know, you get that nice match between industry and the local environment. And again, it's about providing the work or the skills and not just the place. And, you know, you kind of grow it organically. And I know that in the last chapter, I mixed my metaphors a bit between cooking and growing, but I feel like if you feed the local infrastructure, it's kind of like a bit of an expansion of human capital theory. It's human firm theory or something, or investment in firm. So it's growing the local infrastructure through providing work, providing linkages. One of the greatest theorists in this area is a guy called Michael Porter from Harvard. And there was a time where everyone in government circles was quoting Porter because he's the big cluster theorist. But I feel like his theories are often misapplied. But Porter himself was really clear on this. He said government and you know, often higher education should become the challenger and the catalyst to building innovation clusters or industry clusters. He didn't say you should create a place to actually bring them into. He said the role of government is not to be the preeminent player in this.
Yep.
It is to become the challenger and the catalyst. And that's, to me, he got it right. Porter was right on that. But so many people around the world went, clusters are the key to competitiveness. We've got to have a cluster. Let's build a cluster. This will be our cluster. And tried to select industry and provide a place. And I felt like the model was wrong. And that's why we have misstepped quite a bit.
You mentioned Israel before, a global innovation powerhouse, which people might not be aware of, a country based in the desert with 9 million people, limited access, as you write in the book, to fresh water. What's the secret to Israel's success?
Well, I use them as the example of finance-led innovation because, you know, there's a lot of reasons cited for innovation, Israel's success. The fact that they invest highly in military technologies, the fact that they have national service, so you have all these highly educated, networked people that can connect with each other, and building creative partnerships is really important. But, you know, apart from everything else, what stands out about Israel is just their level of R&D investment in their infrastructure. So the average OECD level, I think, is 2.3%. They're up over 5%. So they're double the average world benchmark for R&D investment. And, you know, they've certainly got some dividends out of that. And not only that, they attract far more VC than other places, venture capital, particularly in their neighbourhood. So, you know, they've done a fantastic job of actually creating a lot of IP, a lot of enterprises, a lot of companies, listing them straight on the NASDAQ and bringing in the rewards so that they can reinvest in new companies. And they have become pretty much a Silicon Valley where other places really failed. So
but money alone doesn't do the job, because then you talk about oil-rich Saudi Arabia. It's got money coming out of every part of it, but they've been less successful.
They have just done, and I mentioned this, a new foresight study where they have said, okay, we're going to now invest in ourselves. But I think, and this is the trend in the accumulation of sovereign wealth funds around the world too, of which Australia has one. But, you know, you create sovereign wealth funds to counter for ageing populations and running out of oil and having to switch your economy over. But then you get all these fund managers that don't want to spend it. They just want to invest it in sure things. So they don't spend it on transitioning the economy or providing for aged care or other things. So, you know, to me, you know, Saudi Arabia is a perfect example of that, is that they created this massive sovereign wealth fund, one of the biggest in the world, apart from Norway's, also built off of fossil fuel, you know, benefits. But they then haven't used it to do what they wanted to do with it, which is transition the economy for when the oil ran out or when we weren't buying oil anymore. So, you know, it's there. Why aren't we using it?
Yeah.
And, you know, I feel as though the growth in sovereign wealth funds, you know, is a source of optimism if we can actually get some mechanisms in place to actually use it for what it was collected for.
So you mentioned before about the future of innovation, and people are talking about this moment that we've just been through, the global coronavirus pandemic, as the great reset. And, you know, there is so much to be said about this moment, really, about how we changed the way we worked, the way we thought, but also that it required immense collective innovation to get through it. Like the effort to create the vaccines is one of the great achievements of the modern era. Incredible. Do you think that this moment, this pandemic moment, gives us a glimpse at the future of innovation? Does it also maybe give us a sense of hope about the future?
Well, I mean, I've got to say I'm quite hopeful about it coming out of the pandemic, because it really did challenge us. And even though the pandemic has been absolutely awful, it could have been a lot worse if we didn't have those global platforms. And CEPI, the Centre for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, it created this platform in advance and connected all these centres of disease testing, of which CSIRO was one, to play a part in this role of fast-tracking vaccine development. Prior to the pandemic, the quickest a vaccine had been developed was 5 to 8 years.
Yeah.
You know, during the pandemic, we had vaccines rolling out after 12 months.
Incredible.
Incredible, yeah. And so these technologies, and now CEPI has a mission of creating the next vaccine within 100 days. So what that's going to do for our preparedness and our resilience into the future is amazing. Like, you've just got to say, incredible work. Digital technologies are amazing. Digital twins, which a lot of the vaccine development was done on. AI is another step that's going to come in and make that vaccine development faster.
Yep.
You know, it's encouraging that we now have some tools to use in the face of the next global pandemic.
Well, there's that. And then there's the fact that we were talking about, like, telecommuting, for example, for decades and decades, that the technology existed, it could be done. There were many people, maybe some people in this room, trying to convince their boss that they could work from home a day or two a week. And it was like, oh, no, we can't possibly do that. And then we have to do it. The pandemic forces people to work from home. And lo and behold, it doesn't result in this collapse in productivity at all. It's workable. In fact, it's so workable that some organisations just essentially tell their staff, well, you can just keep working from home. So it brought on a change in the way we work that also in turn opens up huge opportunities and flexibility.
Yeah. And again, you know, I feel it's one of those things which I think we need to study a bit longer to see what the pros and cons are. Because as you said, it's so nice to meet people in person and to get out and socialise and to have those incidental interactions. And
being stuck in your bedroom all day, every day, is probably not a great thing.
I know. And I was wearing Ugg boots when I spoke to you earlier today. But I feel as though, you know, what it might do is sort of limit to some degree some creative partnerships. And as I said, creative partnerships are just like the magic source on some innovation. Most of the big companies in Silicon Valley were created by two founders, and usually they met in their teens or their early 20s in college dorms or computer clubs or, you know, local parks. So having those creative partnerships is really powerful, and often that's a face-to-face enterprise. So I don't want to see university campuses devoid of students.
Oh, no, they're so sad, aren't they?
I know.
I moved to Melbourne during the pandemic and during the Melbourne lockdown, actually, and we live literally a few hundred metres from Melbourne University. And so we'd walk through the campus and it was empty. And there are fewer things sadder, actually, than an empty university campus devoid of students. So we definitely don't want to see that.
So you want, and especially that feeder group of 17 to 22-year-olds, you want them to go to university and learn about life away from their parents. You want them to be able to fail without the, you know, their parents saying, what time are you going to be home? Like, and that might be, you know, one of these sad things too about people living at home for longer, in that they're not going out and having those share houses where they learn how to budget and create partnerships and that sort of thing. So yeah, those incidental interactions. But what it might do is, wherever we are, like, you know, I might be living in Tasmania, a rural town, my social interactions might just change. So it may not be the person I'm working with, who I may or may not get on with. It may be the person I'm going mountain biking with, or it may be the person who I'm, you know, interacting with moreover, who might have different skills that I can connect with. So it may not mean the end of face-to-face interactions. It may just mean that we have distributed innovation systems. And I look at Australia and our organisation in particular, CSIRO, where I'm working now. There's 140 sites across Australia, and we do world-leading research. And a lot of that is we connect virtually, we connect by telephone. We used to do a lot of flying. We're doing a lot less flying now. But it's a great example of how you can still partner with industry and create world-leading innovation and not cluster this physically. And maybe those virtual hubs and the virtual platforms are going to become, you know, come more to the fore in future of innovation. We just wait to see.
I'm going to take some questions in just a sec. So I know we've got a room full of people who know a lot more about this than I do. So put your thinking cap on and we'll come to you for some questions in a minute. But I do want to talk a bit about this new wave of innovation that we're on the cusp of right now. Many forms of innovation, and you just touch on them in one of the latter chapters in your book. The fourth industrial revolution is what it's being called, Industry 4.0. What is this? Tell us about this and the potential opportunities it opens up.
Yeah, okay. So the first industrial revolution was built around a general purpose technology, which was steam. The second was about the internal combustion engine. The third was personal computers. We're up to the fourth, which is internet technologies. And the fourth industrial revolution includes technologies like blockchain, AI, quantum computing, virtual reality and artificial reality, 3D printing, or additive manufacturing. So that's where you can fast prototype and you can manufacture from anywhere. And it really is transforming economies. And if you go to countries in Southeast Asia, they talk about leapfrogging now. So they're not even going through some of that mechanical revolution. They're going straight via, you know, into digital in the fourth industrial revolution, and using some of these technologies to, you know, really just transform their, you know, the way they do things. So they're not working as we used to work in the industrial revolution. They're going straight to the new way of working. And yeah, it's really exciting. As I said, it is going to transform innovation where it's funded. I know a lot of the funds managers are saying now, you know, we've now got an algorithm that can learn which innovations are more likely to succeed. And some of the things about AI is that it can see things that you can't see. You know, it can learn patterns before you can see.
Well, that's patterns. The advantage of it, isn't it?
It can be, yes. And one of the things CSIRO is also doing is a lot of work on ethical AI.
Yes.
So, you know, we make sure that the patterns that it can see are not unethical patterns. So,
well, I was talking to a colleague at Data 61 of yours, Toby Walsh, who's written a book about just this very issue, actually.
Yes, and I heard that podcast, and
some scary stuff in there, actually.
Can be scary, but also it's like any technology. Like a knife is a technology, and most people use it to butter their toast, but it can also use to stab someone in the back. So any technology can be used in a good or a bad way, and it's up to us to cite the bad ways early and regulate against them. And I think, you know, as the National Science Agency, Data 61 is doing a really great job of trying to work out what the pitfalls are. And Stefan Hajkovic, who's here tonight, wrote the AI roadmap for Australia.
Who's been on big ideas in the past as well.
He has, yes. So, yeah, our organisation is trying to grab that nettle and, you know, make sure it doesn't sting us too much in the process. And make sure that the fourth industrial revolution works for us, that technology works for us and not against us, in creating the societies that we actually want to live in, so that we control the machines, they don't necessarily control us.
I mean, we could, in each of those areas that you've described, of blockchain, cryptocurrency, AI, virtual reality, there's at least a whole program in each of those. So that's for another discussion. But just on artificial intelligence and smart machines, there's a lot of focus at the moment. We've been doing quite a bit on big ideas about this: driverless cars, robots, drones, software analytics, and so on. You know, we don't really even know necessarily where it's headed entirely. How well placed are we in Australia in terms of being able to use our expertise and skills in those forms of innovation? Do you know?
Compared to other countries, I think that's something we're still mapping out.
Yep.
I think, you know, on our side, though, we have got an incredible amount of very smart people. We've got high immigration rates. We have attract people from around the world who want to come to Australia and test their skills here. And, you know, we are seeing more money being put into the development of artificial intelligence for Australian applications. And that's why we're so eager, I guess, to get these ethical AI, you know, frameworks up so that we can do that really safely. I think, you know, Australia's got a lot going for it as a country in terms of a talent magnet, which is what they used to call the US. I guess it's really applying it well and making our companies and our people stay here.
Yeah.
That is one of the biggest challenges. So I would love to see Australia become an AI leader. I think everyone at the organisation I work with would love that as well. And you know, certainly we're trying.
Yeah, and we haven't spoken about this, but I mean, Australia's a great place to live, great lifestyle, stable democracy, many of the things that you don't necessarily take for granted in other parts of the world. And actually there have been some people, spoken to some recently, who've moved back to Australia from overseas because of the lifestyle that we offer here. You know, people who've been very successful innovators and entrepreneurs overseas who've come back here. So yeah, there is something to be said for that as well.
Yeah.
Lucy, been great to talk to you. I could keep talking, as people in the room probably can see, but I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to get Jackie to wave the microphone around. And this is the part of the evening where we take questions from you. And it's also the part of the evening where I'll let Avid Reader kind of take over and determine the length of the Q&A and who gets the microphone. So if we have any questions, put up your hand, and over to you, Jackie.
Okay, we are actually out of time. But you got your hands up before I said that. So we're going to take the questions. But we don't have any Zoom questions, so we'll be able to get through.
Okay.
I have to for COVID and for power.
And the power. And get myself to read it. You talked about the three types of innovation that obviously marketing, process, and product. So I'm a former academic in the kind of tech startup space in augmented reality. It really made me realize, and how you've seen that different countries are kind of good at it in different ways, that in that software space, I think there's often maybe even a confusion or whether something is a product or a process improvement, and whether particularly like all what you've looked at from Silicon Valley and others, whether there's something you might talk around that, the weirdness that software innovation overlaps in those, and even partly marketing.
Yeah. It's a great question, because a lot of software just builds on other software and it's integrated. So you do a systems upgrade and it's just, you know, code within code. And it is, you're right, both product and process innovation. And it's often really hard to capture it in the ICT industry because most code isn't IP protected. It's just out there. What I think is really great in ICT innovation, though, is the open innovation models where you are swapping a lot of intellectual property around the world. And that sort of thing. I guess where you can create a product, though, is where you actually can build something new as a discrete thing out of that code. So what you've done with your company, you know, it's a discrete product, and that's where the value is in that, you know, packaging it up and making a new thing out of it. But, you know, all the code that's going in it, like the AR and the VR, you know, you've probably borrowed a lot of that from other areas. So it's borrowed code, creating process innovation, but the way you package it up makes a new product. Don't know if that really answers your question, but you're right. It's a kind of messy area in the ICT industry in particular.
Okay, I'm going to hand over my power. Don't tell anyone.
Just a question about regulation. You haven't really talked about much. As someone who worked in government a long time, I got frustrated a lot with the regulatory environment, and realised that, do you think that we have the right regulatory environment in Australia to support innovation?
Another great question. Thanks, Christine. I think it always needs to be reviewed. Every year we should go through a review in terms of auditing regulation to innovation outcomes, and the industry needs to be involved in that, because, you know, some of the biggest innovation shocks in the US, for instance, came through a regulatory change, like the Bayh-Dole Act or the Prudent Man Rule, that sort of thing, which just unleashed new venture capital and meant that universities could take advantage of the IP that came from federal grants. So yeah, I totally agree that regulation would be some of the hardest things. So what some areas have done to get around that is that they've created regulatory sandpits. So I can't see you, Christine, but they're like, you know, the fintech area has created a fintech sandpit, where it's kind of like they can play in there before releasing their products, and they can work with the regulator to some degree before they actually release a new blockchain or whatever it is they're doing. The OECD has an observatory where they can, a public sector observatory where they can bring things in and say, well, what regulation does this butt up against, and what would we need to do to change that, and is it worth changing it, and that sort of thing. So I think regulatory sandpits are a fantastic idea, but also just regular audits and working with the industry to say, well, what is it that's holding you back here? And, you know, your insights on, like, great to know what regulation you found particularly frustrating, because, you know, different areas have different things. Like some people it's the work health and safety regulations, and other people it's the investment regulations. So it's different depending on where you're innovating. But yeah, I'd be really interested in talking to you later, Christine, and actually hearing what it is in Queensland that's really holding it up.
If anybody has further questions, might I suggest that you ask them while Dr. Cameron is signing your purchased copy of Building an Innovation Hotspot. We'll be setting up a signing table just near the door in a few minutes. In the meantime, thank you both very much for a terrific conversation. Please show your appreciation.
Thanks, Jackie. I probably should apologise for rabbiting on too long and not allowing additional questions, but good suggestion by Jackie.